The United States federal government has shut down. Again. The 19th time since 1976, the 4th time in 6 years, but this time is fundamentally different. Not because of politics, not because of personalities, because of mathematics. What you're witnessing is not routine political theater. This is systematic breakdown of the fiscal mechanisms that have sustained the global economy since World War II. And the economic implications extend far beyond delayed paychecks and closed national parks. Let me show you exactly what happens when a $27 trillion economy loses its central coordinating mechanism. Let me walk you through the mathematics of systematic economic disruption. And let me explain why this shutdown represents something fundamentally different from every previous government closure in American history. Because when you understand the numbers, when you see the cascading effects, when you recognize the pattern, you realize this is not about political dysfunction. This is about the structural fragility of an economy built on continuous federal spending, unlimited debt expansion, and the assumption that government operations never stop. The assumption just failed, and the mathematics are brutal. Every government shutdown follows the same economic progression. Immediate effects that seem manageable, secondary effects that compound exponentially, tertiary effects that persist long after government operations resume, and systemic effects that reveal fundamental structural weaknesses in the entire economic architecture. This shutdown is happening at the worst possible time, in the worst possible economic conditions, with the worst possible fiscal backdrop. The margin for error that existed during previous shutdowns no longer exists. The economic resilience that could absorb temporary disruptions has been exhausted. The federal government directly employs approximately 2.1 million civilian workers. During a shutdown, roughly 800,000 are furloughed immediately. These workers stop spending money on housing, food, transportation, and consumer goods. Local economies around federal facilities experience immediate demand destruction that spreads through surrounding communities. But that's just the beginning. Federal contractors employ approximately 4 million workers, whose paychecks depend entirely on continuous government operations. Unlike federal employees, who eventually receive back pay after shutdowns end, contractors often absorb shutdown costs permanently. When government contracts stop, contractor payments stop. When contractor payments stop, subcontractor payments stop. The ripple effect moves through the entire supply chain that serves federal operations. Small businesses that provide services to government facilities, restaurants near federal buildings, hotels that host government conferences, airlines that transport federal employees, rental car companies, office suppliers, maintenance services, security firms. The economic damage spreads exponentially from the initial point of disruption. State and local governments receive approximately $700 billion annually in federal funding. Education programs, transportation infrastructure, healthcare systems, social services, law enforcement grants, emergency management. When federal operations shut down, transfer payments to states slow or stop entirely. States face immediate budget shortfalls that force cuts to essential services or emergency borrowing that adds debt. But the real economic damage occurs in financial markets that depend on continuous Treasury operations. The United States government issues approximately $3 trillion in new debt annually to finance operations and refinance maturing obligations. During shutdowns, new debt issuance stops. Refinancing operations halt. The primary mechanism for global dollar liquidity freezes. This creates immediate stress in global financial markets that use Treasury securities as collateral for lending operations, repo markets that facilitate overnight lending between financial institutions, money market funds that provide liquidity to corporate operations, international banks that use Treasury bonds as reserve assets for regulatory capital requirements. When Treasury issuance stops, global dollar liquidity contracts. When global dollar liquidity contracts, credit spreads widen across all markets. When credit spreads widen, borrowing costs increase for corporations, municipalities, and foreign governments. The economic damage compounds geometrically through interconnected financial systems. Previous government shutdowns occurred during periods of economic expansion when the private sector could absorb temporary disruptions. Employment was rising, corporate profits were growing, consumer confidence was high, interest rates were low. The economy had momentum that could carry it through brief interruptions to government operations. This shutdown is occurring during a period of maximum economic fragility. Corporate debt levels are at historic highs. Consumer savings rates are at historic lows. Bank lending standards are tightening rapidly. Economic growth is slowing. Inflation remains persistent despite Federal Reserve intervention. Interest rates are at restrictive levels not seen since 2007. The economy has no momentum to absorb disruption. Every economic indicator suggests the system is operating at maximum stress levels. Government shutdown removes the primary stabilizing mechanism at exactly the moment when stabilization is most critical for preventing broader systemic breakdown. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that each week of government shutdown reduces quarterly GDP growth by approximately 0.1 percentage points. A 4-week shutdown reduces annual growth by approximately 0.2%. That translates to roughly $50 billion in lost economic output for every month of closure. But CBO estimates only capture direct measurable effects. They don't account for confidence effects that cause businesses to delay investment decisions indefinitely. They don't measure international effects that cause foreign entities to question long-term dollar stability. They don't quantify financial market effects that increase borrowing costs throughout the entire economy for months after shutdowns end. Independent economic analysis suggests total costs are 3 to 4 times larger than official government estimates. A 4-week shutdown could reduce annual economic output by $150 to $200 billion. The damage persists for quarters after government operations resume because confidence effects take time to reverse, and investment decisions delayed during uncertainty don't get made up later. During the 2018-2019 shutdown, the longest in American history at 35 days, consumer confidence fell to recession levels. Business investment declined for 3 consecutive quarters. Federal contractors experienced permanent revenue losses that forced layoffs and business closures. State and local governments increased emergency borrowing to maintain services, adding debt burden that required years to repay through higher taxes. The economic damage was officially estimated at $25 billion in lost output. But that occurred during highly favorable economic conditions. Strong employment growth, rising real wages, expanding corporate profits, interest rates near historic lows that made borrowing cheap and refinancing easy. Economic momentum that could absorb temporary shocks. Current economic conditions are precisely opposite. Employment growth is slowing toward potential recession levels. Real wages are declining due to persistent inflation, eroding purchasing power. Corporate profits are under severe pressure from rising input costs. Interest rates are at 15-year highs, making borrowing expensive and refinancing difficult for over-leveraged entities. A shutdown of similar duration today would cause significantly more economic damage because the economy lacks the resilience that existed 5 years ago. The mathematical amplification effects would be substantially larger due to the fragile initial conditions across all economic sectors. But the real danger isn't economic damage from the specific shutdown. The real danger is what government shutdowns reveal about systematic political dysfunction that makes basic fiscal operations impossible on a recurring basis. The United States government operates on continuing resolutions and debt ceiling increases that require constant political negotiation. Every few months, Congress must vote to keep the government operating. Every year or two, Congress must vote to allow additional borrowing. Both votes are consistently treated as opportunities for political leverage rather than routine administrative functions necessary for basic government operation. This creates constant uncertainty about fundamental government operations that makes long-term economic planning impossible for businesses, investors, and foreign governments. Economic systems require predictability to function efficiently. Political systems that deliberately inject uncertainty into routine operations impose massive hidden costs on economic efficiency throughout the entire economy. International confidence in dollar stability depends fundamentally on confidence in American political stability. When the American government cannot perform basic functions like keeping itself operational, international observers reasonably question whether America can perform complex functions like global economic leadership and crisis management. China and Russia are actively developing comprehensive alternative financial systems designed to bypass dollar dominance entirely. European nations are exploring strategic autonomy that reduces dependence on American political decisions. Middle Eastern nations are systematically diversifying reserve holdings away from dollar-denominated assets toward gold and other alternatives. Government shutdowns accelerate these de-dollarization trends by demonstrating American political dysfunction in the most visible way possible to international observers. Each shutdown provides additional evidence that America cannot reliably manage its own fiscal affairs, much less global economic affairs that require steady leadership. The mathematical trajectory is completely unsustainable. Federal debt increases by approximately $1.5 trillion annually. Interest payments on existing debt consume increasingly larger portions of federal revenue. The percentage of government spending dedicated to discretionary programs continues declining, while mandatory spending for entitlements continues rising automatically. Within 10 years, interest payments alone will exceed total defense spending. Within 15 years, interest payments plus mandatory spending will exceed total federal revenue. The government will be completely unable to fund any discretionary operations without borrowing 100% of the money required for basic functions. At that mathematical point, political negotiations over government funding become negotiations over whether to allow the federal government to exist at all. The stakes become so extraordinarily high that political compromise becomes mathematically impossible. Government shutdowns become permanent rather than temporary disruptions. We are approaching that mathematical threshold much faster than most people realize. And current government shutdowns provide vivid preview of what happens when we cross it. The economy simply stops functioning in any recognizable way that maintains current living standards. Federal employees stop receiving paychecks. Contractors stop receiving payments. State governments stop receiving transfers. Social Security becomes irregular. Medicare halts. Military salaries delayed. Veterans' benefits stop. The economic disruption becomes severe. Basic commerce breaks down. Supply chains halt. Transportation systems shut down. Healthcare systems reduce services. This is mathematical certainty based on current trajectories. The question is not whether this happens. The question is when and how quickly it deteriorates. International observers understand this trajectory. That's why de-dollarization accelerates. That's why alternative currencies are developed. That's why trade agreements bypass dollars. Foreign entities prepare for American fiscal collapse. The next shutdown will last longer and cause more damage. Each cycle increases costs while decreasing incentives for compromise. This is imperial decline progression and repeated throughout history. Political institutions become dysfunctional as fiscal pressure increases. Pressure increases as debt costs consume larger portions of revenue. Revenue generation becomes difficult as growth slows. The feedback loop becomes self-reinforcing. Political dysfunction reduces confidence. Reduced confidence slows growth. Slower growth reduces revenue. Reduced revenue increases pressure. Increased pressure worsens dysfunction. Rome experienced this pattern. Spain experienced it. Britain experienced it. The mathematics are identical. The outcome is always the same. Political institutions fail when fiscal mathematics become unsustainable. The United States is following this progression precisely. Government shutdowns are mile markers on the road to collapse. Each shutdown moves America closer to where compromise becomes impossible. The current shutdown is not the crisis. The shutdown is warning that crisis approaches. When it arrives, it will be too late to prevent through negotiation. The mathematics will be irreversible. Government shutdowns provide a glimpse of what happens when continuous operations can no longer be maintained. Economic systems built on government stability cannot function when stability becomes questionable. The smart money understands this. Capital flight from dollar assets is accelerating. Safe haven demand for gold is increasing. International diversification away from American political risk is becoming priority. The current shutdown will end eventually, but underlying conditions will continue deteriorating until shutdowns become permanent rather than temporary. The economy that depends on government stability will adjust to instability. The process will be devastating. Government shutdown is not political theater. Government shutdown is economic preview of imperial collapse. The mathematics are clear. The outcome is inevitable. The United States federal government shutdown just provided your warning. What you do determines whether you survive what comes next. Time is short. Act now. Prepare.